Shavua Tov. I'd like to dedicate this shiur to David and Rachel Stern. I was very sorry to miss the Machon Shilo event last week, the Seudat Hodaya for them. I listened to recordings of some of the speeches given, and I think I'm just in awe of their courage, and it was very moving to hear their words and those of Jonathan Pollard. And I think I expect there may be more recordings that will come out as well that I still haven't gotten a chance to enjoy, but I feel great regret that I didn't get to make it there, and I feel as well inspired to try to say something in this shiur that I hope might be relevant to the same kind of discussion. So I was reading, actually I'll start with a source that is very far from Tanakh. I was reading an article in the Times of Israel this evening that is about a recent statement made by Rav Moshe Lichtenstein, who's the head of Yeshivat Har Etzion in Gush Etzion. The article was in Times of Israel, published, I guess maybe yesterday, and the title is "Head of Prestigious Yeshiva, Settler Riots, a Moral Stain on Us All, contravene Torah." And I think in the spirit of beginning with what can be said that is positive, the same way that the students of Hillel would acknowledge the arguments of those with whom they would seek to disagree before disagreeing. I certainly have been a great beneficiary over the years of many different sources of Torah learning that have come out of Yeshivat Har Etzion. I think there are many brilliant minds there, and it's clear that in one sense it is a place where there's a great deal of profound knowledge of Torah, and where one can learn a lot about how to study Tanakh, about how to study Talmud. At the same time, I can't quite say I'm disappointed in the sense of surprised by the remarks that I'm about to quote, because it's also true that Yeshivat Har Etzion tends to take a very self-regarding and enlightened view when it comes to politics, and particularly politics as pertains to Israel and its security and things like that. But these remarks in particular, I think, are a jumping off point for a response that I think fits the moment. So I'll just read some quotations from the articles first. Rabbi Moshe Lichtenstein, the co-head of the prestigious Har Etzion Religious Seminary in the Alon Shvut settlement in the West Bank, spoke in a Facebook post of, quote, a double pain, both for the deaths of innocent Israelis who were murdered in cold blood, quote, in recent terror attacks in the West Bank, as well as, quote, pain for the acts of revenge by lost and misbegotten souls. Lichtenstein said he was disappointed that clear and sharp condemnations had not so far been issued by key leaders in the communities from which Jewish assailants had come, and thus, quote, I will allow myself to sound the cry. And went on to say, he said the entire public is responsible, quote, is responsible for creating the atmosphere that allowed these acts to take place, end quote, and thus must conduct serious soul searching. And the last bit that I will just read is, while stressing the security forces should act aggressively against terror, he underlined that, quote, harm to those who have not committed a crime is a moral and religious wrong that stands in opposition to all values of the Torah, end quote, and is, quote, also a desecration of God, end quote. Lichtenstein noted that, quote, the central problem with sowing destruction in Palestinian villages is not the loss of governance or the harm to settlement community, but rather the moral wrong, end quote, of the act. And he said one could not, quote, ignore the historic associative connection to pogroms in Jewish villages across the generations and our responsibility in light of brackets this past toward villages we control, end quote. Now, this is an article, so it's not the whole remarks. So it could be that there are elements in the entirety of the remarks that might in some way balance these comments. But I think there are a number of things in these comments that span the range between, I would say, irresponsibly vague in dealing with a very important issue that should require a carefulness in thinking about the implications in Torah that seems to be absent here. And I'll explain what I mean by that. It spans the range from there over to being simply disgraceful. And the easy thing to point out that is simply disgraceful is the last thing that I quoted, which is a mention of pogroms, right? That it's a favorite thing now, if anywhere Jews ever act in a way that seems unruly and destructive and threatening towards communities that have been a source of murderers of Jews, that this is somehow the shoe on the other foot, where now the pogrom is being committed by the Jews. And the use of the word pogrom is very deliberate. It's meant to shame Jews into looking in the mirror and asking, oh, what have I become? And there's something disgracefully inaccurate and manipulative about the use of this term, which anyone, I think, with a sober and accurate knowledge of Jewish history and of the Jewish present should be able to recognize. Because, first of all, we have no reason to generalize the term pogrom into an abstract category that makes it a tool in the hands of whoever wants to accuse whomever else of engaging in certain kinds of behavior. The idea of the pogrom came out of Jewish history as the notion of nations amongst whom the Jews were living gathering together to go and attack and murder Jews and destroy their homes, but particularly to murder them, and to talk in terms that makes a pogrom sound like it's a tool that can be turned around and inflicted by Jews on someone else. There's no reason to begin with to take this term and give it a more general meaning. But as soon as one does, interestingly, it reverberates back into one's understanding of history. You know, I doubt this was the intention of Rav Lichtenstein, but of course the implication of using a term like this is to suggest that we consider whether perhaps there might have been something that Jews murdered by Cossacks in the Pale of Settlement, you know, could have done to inflame or anger the Cossacks, right? Because the current riots that have gone on in the last, recently and also in the last few months in Yehuda and Shimshon, obviously have had driving forces behind them as harsh and horrific as the murder of Jews by their Arab neighbors in Yehuda and Shimshon. And to the degree that that's the case, calling this a pogrom is taking the notion of a pogrom and saying this is a thing that can happen, where it's in a sense a retaliation for the worst sort of horrific violence being inflicted on oneself. And so in this case, where clearly the Jews were doing whatever it is that they're doing, which by the way has led to some destruction of property, but has, unlike actual pogroms, not so far led to loss of life on the other side in any significant number or possibly at all, depending on how you calculate it, that these events in the present are an outcry coming from the communal pain of recent multiple or mass murders, and to take that and add it to the definition of a pogrom is it's spitting in the eye of generations of Jews who lived through actual pogroms, and it's an activity that many Jews are very willing to engage in because the knowledge we gained from Jewish history and what was inflicted on us is somehow very, very cheap, or it's quickly for sale as an abstraction to be used to self-criticize, to denounce other Jews, and to morally condemn ourselves, as though the point of it was just to learn some general lesson for humanity, as opposed perhaps to learning that we should be trying to prevent people from murdering Jews because of how much it used to happen when we didn't have the means. So just on the basis of that, I think these comments become suspect and really beyond that, as I said before, disgraceful. And I don't think the abuse of and cheapening of the term pogrom in this comment, it's not limited to this comment. It's part of a more general activity of stereotypical, and I would say mostly, if not entirely, Ashkenazic Jewish self-hatred, or let's say self-undermining or self-flagellation before the perceived world community looking on. And this kind of rhetoric needs to be right out and not part of how we explain what's going on to each other or to the rest of the world, because it just emboldens people who would commit actual pogroms, which I think we can retain as being a word defined to mean mob behavior that leads to the mass murder of Jews. So that's a first point. I think also more generally in these comments, it has to be acknowledged as well that there's something very thin, as I mentioned at the beginning, about this idea of what's going on is a crime is the term, harm, because harm to those who have not committed a crime is a moral and religious wrong that stands in opposition to all the values of the Torah. Sorry, so it's being called a moral failing and a desecration because it's about harm being done to those who haven't committed a crime. So again, in the spirit of acknowledging the sense of someone else's argument, clearly it's easy to understand the idea that riotous behavior should be condemned and should be prevented, because lawlessness rarely leads to the best kind of behavior, the most effective or the most morally acceptable. And so it's not difficult to relate to the sensible side of anyone who's standing up, or rather I'd say it's not difficult from the perspective of Torah to relate to the sensible side of anyone who's standing up and saying, let's put a stop to riotous behavior, let's be more disciplined about this somehow. But I think these comments go very far in excoriating Jews who've been acting this way in a way that isn't backed up by the comments. Like, to say that it's a moral and religious wrong that stands in opposition to all values of the Torah, well, all values of the Torah is a very big set of things. And it is important for us to ask whether indeed that's really a fair statement. And in any case, I would have hoped, and here's where, to be fair, these are quotations in the Times of Israel. It's not clear that the Times of Israel how much they're cherry picking the full statement. So perhaps it would be fair to look at the whole statement, but I kind of doubt that I would find there what I would have hoped from, what I would have hoped to hear from someone representing or carrying the banner of Torah here, which is an argument actually from the standpoint of Torah. Instead of just making a summary dismissal, let's talk about what is the problem here. And you could say different things. You could say, okay, dina machuta dina, like if it's illegal to do something, even when you're being ruled by goyim who don't necessarily have laws that are based on Torah, then generally speaking, except in certain exceptional circumstances, you're supposed to obey the law. And so lawlessness is, asur, it's prohibited by the rabbis, and we should decry it, right? So you could make that kind of argument. That would be an actual argument from Torah, and this is kal v'chomer, because this is, in a Jewish society, where the laws perhaps, although they aren't based on Torah per se, they are closer to that than in another setting where dina malchuta dina might have still applied. So that's one kind of argument you could make. Another kind of argument that you could make is, on the other hand, that maybe this isn't a situation where we're talking about criminal proceedings, so to speak, and that there's a different construct to put on this that also deserves discussion from the standpoint of Torah, right? Because looking at things through the lens of who is a criminal and who is not, like who's committed a crime and who hasn't, that's one way of looking at it, where there's a sense from the standpoint of Torah. There's another way of looking at it that says there are situations that are called wars, and in wars, different kinds of behaviors become permitted or forbidden, and it's a different construct that we put on it that also comes from the Torah. And who gets harmed during a war and what is moral or acceptable in the eyes of Torah is a different set of things, or is a different set of people than we're looking at this in terms of criminal procedure. Now, this is, I would say, especially a pertinent point to make in a situation where you also have to consider the right of people to self-defense, meaning that and this is now, the political comment, if you look at the situation, Yehuda Shimron, I think a much broader range of people might agree that having lawless, riotous behavior be some kind of component in a strategy for fighting back against an enemy is not really necessarily the best idea if you're going to be effective. But if a condition is created where Jews whose lives are constantly in danger and are being constantly attacked by an enemy have their hands tied, and they're not allowed to have weapons, or they're not allowed to use the weapons that they have to fight, to defend themselves effectively, because of a regime that establishes a system of regulations and a system that supposedly exists to defend them, but isn't sufficient in the way that it does that. At what point does it become the case that acting in self-defense involves acting lawlessly, right? That is something that has to be asked, when we're talking about people who seemingly have relatively little inclination to act lawlessly, but maybe have been driven to the brink by a chronic condition of being made to live like sitting ducks without enough being done to defend them on the roads or in their homes or wherever else. So that isn't a call to lawless behavior or even entirely necessarily an attempt to justify lawless behavior on its face, but it's an analysis of a condition that says, if you don't want these kinds of things to happen, then maybe the solution to the problem doesn't lie in, especially when talking about the leader of a religious community, like what should a leader like Rav Lichtenstein be saying? Maybe it would be more useful to be saying that we all want a world in which Jews never feel the need to act this way, but we should be asking why it is that they feel the need to act this way and whether enough is being done to allow them to defend themselves or to make them safe. And I don't think that that's a unreasonable question to ask in these circumstances where there are particular roads where you have constant violent attacks that sometimes lead to Jews dying and sometimes, Baruch Hashem, do not. And it's allowed to remain the case that they keep on going and keep on happening. And a rate of murder that's greater than zero is practically speaking being deemed acceptable by the defense and security forces right now. So that is all a comment on current events. And as I said before, I really want to dedicate this shiur to David and Rachel Stern, who survived one of these attacks in our land by our enemies against our people miraculously, Baruch Hashem. And as I said before, I'm in awe of them and of their courage and their commitment to Torah and Eretz Yisrael. And I truly regret not getting to participate in the Seudat Hodaya last week. But now that we have commented earlier on the present day politics, there's also a way of bringing this whole discussion into Torah and into our sources, because I think it's not actually unrelated. This overarching discussion about what are you supposed to do when Jews are not actually letting other Jews defend themselves, and where does this lead, and what kind of behavior and how we should judge it. This is actually a topic that we have multiple sources of, running from Tanakh through the Gemara, and there's actually a string of passages that Chazal seem to think are related and connected on this subject. So what I want to begin with is by talking about fairly well-known Gemara from Sotah, Masechet Sotah, Yud Gimel Aleph. And this is about the moment of the burial of Yaakov Avinu. So at this moment where Yaakov is being buried, the sons are gathered around, the sons of Yaakov, and who should show up but Esau? So Esau, the brother of Yaakov Avinu. And this is in a sense, a Midrash Agadah on a pasuk in Parshat Vayechi where Yaakov Avinu was blessing Naphtali. And it says about Naphtali, Naphtali ayala shlucha, hanoten imrei shafer. So, story begins. Amar lehu, havuli igarta, amrulei, igarta be'ara, demitzrayim he. Ume'en nazil Naphtali, the Khalil ki ayalata dichtiv Naphtali ayala shlucha hanoten imrei shafer. Amar Rabbi Avahu al tikrei imrei shafer ela imrei sefer. Okay, so we're not going to focus on all of this, but in particular, we want to talk about the fact that Esav is standing here, and I've heard different versions of this Agadata in different parts of Shas, and sometimes it's Esav, and sometimes it's Ephron Achiti. And in what I just read, it was already referring to, who was speaking, kind of in the third person, not specifically. But so the translation given here is Esau said to them, "Bring the bill of sale to me. If you can't prove your claims." And they said to him, "The bill of sale is in the land of Egypt." They said, "And who will go to bring it?" "Naphtali will go, for he is fast as a doe, as it is written. Naphtali is a doe let loose, he gives goodly words." And Rabbi Abahu says, "Do not read it as goodly words, imrei shafer, rather read it as imrei sefer, right, the words of the book." So the shtar, the bill of sale for Marat HaMachpelah. And then what should happen? But so Hushim, Birei Hadidan, Taman Hava, V'yakiran le udne. Amar lehu, mai hai. V'amru le, ka me'akev hai ad de'ati naftali me'ara di Mitzrayim. Amar lehu, va'ad de'ati naftali me'ara di Mitzrayim. Yehi avi abba mutal v'vizayon shekal klufa michai areshe natran einei unaflu akara de Yaakov. Petchono Yaakov le'enei ve'achech ve'heinu dichtiv yismach tzadik ki hazan akam pa'amav yohatz bedan harasha. So Hushim, the son of Dan, was there, and his ears were heavy, meaning he was hard of hearing. Although I think we could ask what it really means that his ears were heavy in a second. He said to them, "What is this that is delaying the burial?" And these are added sort of explications in the midst of what's actually coming from the words of the Gemara. And they said to him, "This one, Esau, is preventing us from burying Yaakov until Naphtali comes back from the land of Mitzrayim with the bill of sale." And he said to them, "And until Naphtali comes back from the land of Mitzrayim, will our father's father lie in degradation?" And he took a club and hit Esau on the head. And Esau's eyes fell out and they fell on the legs of Yaakov. And Yaakov opened his eyes and smiled. And this is which is written, "The righteous shall rejoice when he sees vengeance. He shall wash his feet in the blood of the wicked," which is a quote, a pasuk from Tehillim. All right, so that's a fairly well-known midrash. And the question is, how does it pertain to the present discussion? So the scene we have is that we have the Bnei Yisrael, right, the sons of Yaakov, who are standing trying to bury Yaakov, and Esav is the brother of Yaakov, or you could say maybe it's Ephron Achiti, and it's actually the one who sold Merata Bachpelah. Those are two different concepts that maybe you get from different replications of this Agadata in Shas. In one case, it would be Ephron, who basically is trying to question whether or not indeed the sale was made, and he's in a sense contesting the claim of Bnei Yisrael to Eretz Yisrael on the basis of saying, look, we were here first. And either that or it's Esav, and in that case, the contest is being made in an even more substantive way, because Esav would therefore be saying essentially, look, I'm part of the family of Abraham also, right? I'm part of the family of Yitzhak also. So why is this a place for Yaakov to be buried, but not a place for me to be buried? Why is it Yaakov's inheritance and not mine? And so it pertains in a sense to the selling of the firstborn status that is described in the Torah. And what's interesting is that the sons of Yaakov mostly are responding to this as though it's a legal question, right? They're saying, oh, hang on, we're going to get the bill of sale. We have a document that proves that the cave of the Machpelah belongs to us, that this land belongs to us implicitly. Just, wait a moment and Naphtali will run back to Mitzrayim. And so, in a sense, the Gemara is anticipating that it is a tendency of our nation to want to deal with these situations in legal terms, right? To see a conflict over the very claim that we have to make to our heritage in Hebron, Marat Machpelah, or to the land of Israel in general, and to say, let's all be civilized about this. Let's all study the law, agree about the facts of the law, and we'll make our arguments and we'll sort this out. This is a case to be brought to court. And that's because that's how the Torah wants us to deal with each other, by the way, right? The ideal that is conceived of by the Torah is that Am Yisrael should, by example, show the world that, yeah, when you disagree with people, you don't have to hit them in the head with a club. You can have a legal system that allows you to settle disputes because there will be justice, there will be din, there will be learned scholars of Torah who are sitting in a Beit Din, and you can bring your case to them, and you can expect that there will be fair judgment, and it will be done l'shem shamayim. It will be done for the sake of heaven, for the sake of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's what He wants from us, right? So it's not wrong or a bad thing that Bnei Israel, on the one hand, are saying, okay, let's try to solve this with the law. However, Hushim is not having any of it. Hushim ben Dan, he's the son of Dan. He's actually, seemingly from the genealogies recorded in the Torah, the only son of Dan. And it's interesting because one time there's one son of Dan, and one time the one son of Dan is called Hushim, and another time he's called Shuchim. This is in the text of the Chumash itself. So he has these two names, which are anagrams of each other. And he is being described as having heavy ears, which, is in the Lashon of the Gemara, you could say, okay, maybe that means he's deaf or hard of hearing. I think you could also say his ears are heavy from the talk that he's hearing, right? And he's not having any of it because he doesn't understand why people are standing around and solving this problem with conversation. And he asked them, he said, look, there's an outrage here, right? He's saying that their grandfather is mutal bevizayon, that he's being made a bizayon, he's being made into a degradation. And that for him means, look, the talk is over. We're not in a situation where this is, okay, we are all decent people who want to follow the law and accept the source of the law, and we're going to make our arguments, and then judgment will be rendered. And also, we're not the same nation that shares one law and one land, right? Esav represents, or Ephron HaChiti represents, the idea of a foreign element that is laying some kind of alternate claim, but is doing so in a way that implicitly poses a threat to the nation's very existence, right? Because this isn't just about, who gets to bury someone where in one little hole in the ground, right? This is about the claim of Bnei Yisrael to Eretz Yisrael, which means it's really an existential question about whether Bnei Yisrael get to be a nation in their land or not. And it's interesting, Naphtali is running back to Mitzrayim. Why? Because they didn't bring this from Mitzrayim. Because at some level, the idea of Bnei Yisrael going to Eretz Yisrael, it's not supposed to be something that requires a legal document, right? Now, clearly they're here, they're burying Yaakov. In one sense, you could say they're planning to go back to Mitzrayim because it's at this moment where Yosef is bringing Yaakov to be buried, but they haven't decided to leave for Eretz Yisrael permanently yet. But the text is still kind of suggesting, in some sense, leave the contract in Mitzrayim, because when you get to Eretz Yisrael, you're supposed to be kicking down the door, right? It's not about you're not checking into an Airbnb, and someone sent you the code by email, right? This is your birthright that gets given to you by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but the expectation is that one will need to fight for it. And so it's not a matter of showing a legal document to the Hittites, or showing a legal document to Edom, showing a legal document to those who also lay claim to the land, those who reject the claim of Bnei Israel to their heritage. It's a matter of showing strength in the face of that position, which is what Hushim does. And he knocks off the head, or rather he hits the head of Esav with a club and knocks out his eyes. And then Yaakov opens his eyes, and then he recites a pasuk from Tehillim that refers to seeing. Yismach tzaddik ki chazanakam, that for a tzaddik to behold vengeance, that is when the tzaddik is happy. And so I think we're already getting here a very sophisticated commentary from the Gemara about this, where it's saying, look, we know who Am Yisrael are. Am Yisrael are a people who more than any other people ever in human history, respect the idea of the law and the value of a law given by Hashem that will bring peace to the land, that will bring justice to the land. And so, of course, it's going to be our instinct to always say, okay, we have to deal with this with a legal argument, and let's go to the court and we'll bring our documents and we'll prove that UN Security Council resolution, whatever number, I'm proud to not know the number of any UN Security Council resolution that purports to be relevant to the legality or illegality of anything that the state of Israel does in its own land. But we can make whatever argument. Oh, this Security Council resolution, it never, actually said this or never actually said that. And many Jews are very skilled at making these arguments. But at the end of the day, that's not why Eretz Yisrael belongs to Am Yisrael. And it's not going to be something that Am Yisrael can hold on to unless we have people like Hushim ben Dan who are willing to say, stop with all of this talk. My ears are heavy with this, or I can't even hear exactly what you're saying. And because I can't hear, I'm the only one who actually is capable of doing what's right in this situation, which is talking to Esav, quote unquote, in the language that he understands, and hitting him so hard that he can't see straight. And not only that, I think that really in this Gemara, what we're seeing is a reference to a variety of other things that are going on in Tanakh that have to do with Shevet Dan, right? Hushim is from Shevet Dan. And there is a notable greatest of the Shoftim in Sefer Shoftim from Shevet Dan, which is Shimshon ben Manoach. And Shimshon ben Manoach is being referenced this way, being referenced here in a variety of ways. For one thing, Hushim, right? We said Hushim, Shulchim. He has these two names. They're anagrams of each other. The other anagram is Umashiach, right? And whether you think of Shimshon as a sort of proto-Mashiach because he's kind of a first, or he's not a first king in Israel, but he has a kind of malchut about him in terms of, he's fighting the Plishtim the way that David will fight the Plishtim. And he's showing this gvura, he's leading, he's judging in Israel, but also that he's a Nazir. So there's this notion of there's something special that he's crowned in this way by what's on his head, the way a Mashiach is. But not only that, we have all of these other references running through, right? Because the notion of eyes here, right? That Hushim is hitting Esav and knocking out his eyes. Who gets his eyes gouged out? Shimshon, right? From Shevet Dan. When the Plishtim finally take hold of him, Shimshon gets his eyes knocked out. And interestingly, also Yitzhak, who favored Esav over Yaakov, himself was blind, and that's connected with his sort of seemingly mistaken favoritism towards Esav. So this notion of sight is also tracing us over to Shimshon. But I would say even more so thematically that Shimshon is all about the idea and the way that Hushim is acting here, and maybe that Shevet Dan represents in general the same way that he's described, elsewhere in the Torah. Shevet Dan is described as a snake that bites the heel of the horse and throws down its rider, sort of the idea of something a little bit treacherous and a little bit, snakes that bite we don't think of as the good guy, but in this case it's the snake that bites the horse that throws the rider, and the horse and rider, that's like Paro with his chariot, right? So there's this notion of that in order to beat Paro, or in order to, for the nation to stand up, there needs to be a bit of lawlessness. And what Hushim ben Dan is tracing over to represent in Shimshon. Shimshon is all about that. Shimshon goes and marries a Plishtit woman, a Philistine woman, and he knows that it's because he wants to pick a fight with them, but it seems like he's doing something that's, not proper and not kasher. And he seems to over and over again be acting in these ways that are very unruly. He's a brawler, and you can criticize him and say, maybe Shimshon is not being held up as an ideal. the same way that you might criticize Hushim's behavior for not, joining the crowd of legalists and lawyers who are trying to solve the problem in court, so to speak. But at the end of the day here, this comment by Chazal on Hushim maybe becomes a comment also on Shimshon and says, look, yes, Shimshon was a problem at some level, but who is the good guy in the story ultimately when we read about Shimshon? Vayomeru ish Yehuda lama alitem aleinu vayomeru le'asor et Shimshon alinu la'asot lo kasher asa lanu. So the men of Yehuda say to the Plishtim, why are you coming up against us? And they answered, to bind Shimshon have we come up, to do to him as he has done to us. וירדו 3,000 איש מיהודה אל סעיף סלע איתם, ויאמרו לשמשון, הלא ידעת כי מושלים בנו פלישתים, ומה זאת עשית לנו? ויאמר להם, כאשר עשו לי, כן עשיתי להם. So 3,000 men of Yehuda went to the top of the rock Etam and said to Shimshon, do you not know that the Plishtim will rule over us? What is this you've done to us? And he said to them, as they did to me, so I have done to them. So these very reasonable Jews, these very reasonable Yehudim, are going to Shimshon and they're saying, look, the Plishtim are our rulers, right? Really, they make the rules here. Really, we have to have the proper regard for how we're allowed to behave in this situation. And you're the one who's the problem because you're fighting the Plishtim and you're defeating them, yes. And yes, you're doing battle with them and it's all very heroic, but think of all the problems you're making for all these other Jews by acting in this way, by being lawless, by being unruly, by being violent, etc. ויאמרו לו, לעשרך ירדנו, לתתך ביד פלישתים, ויאמר להם, שמשון, הישבעו לי, פן תפגעון בי אתם. And they said to him, we have come down to bind you, that we may deliver you to the hand of the Plishtim. And Shimshon said to them, swear to me that you will not fall upon me yourselves. And so they tie him up and they give him to the Plishtim, and then he breaks free and he fights some more of them. He kills a bunch of them with the jawbone of a hamor, of an ass. And the point is that in this moment, what we are seeing is something that is disturbingly similar to many respects, in many respects to what sadly we find in Yehuda and Shomron right now, which is that it's very easy to find Jews who are willing to denounce other Jews for being unruly in the way that they are trying to fight against an enemy that's around them, that is attacking them left and right, that's murdering them left and right, and where their hands are being tied by Jews, right? So there are many different ways of fighting an enemy. Almost all of those are off the table because there is a system in place, and granted, Baruch Hashem, it is not a system that is ultimately ruled by Plishtim. It is a system that is, one would hope, better than that, which is the system run by Jews. But the system that's being run by Jews now is not keeping the Jews who live there safe, but it is imposing rules for Jews that prevent them from defending themselves with a free hand. And so you have in Tanakh the anticipation of a situation in which Jews are going to come and they're actually going to tie up another Jew who's doing the best job fighting the enemy, because the way he's fighting the enemy is somehow, making waves, causing problems for them. They want things more than anything to stay on an even keel, to stay stable, to be done according to the rules, even when the rules are being set by the enemy. And that tendency of our nation to desire to keep things stable and rule-bound, even when the rules are being set by our oppressors, is something that our tradition makes us painfully aware of in these ancient sources, and all the more painfully aware of when we realize it's a problem in the present day that Bezrat Hashem one day we will figure out how to rise above. So I think in the end, what we have to recognize from these sources, the Gemara about Hushim ben Dan, and also this passage about Shimshon, is that it is, of course, part of the ideal of Am Yisrael to bring about a state of affairs in our land where it is a land of law and a land of justice and a land of peace and all of these things. And that is achieved according to the Torah by our being willing to actually conquer the land, to take hold of it, and to do what one needs to fight back enemies who are opposed to that process. And to do so through war, and to do so through the identification of people who are willing to, live amongst us according to the rules, and also the willingness to identify those who aren't, and to deal with them as enemies and to defeat them. And what Shimshon ultimately represents there is that, and also Hushim ben Dan, it may perhaps be that part of that process is being willing to act in ways that are not skipping to the end, and already imagining that we can deal with the world as though there's some kind of utopia governed by laws, when the laws are being made by our enemies, whether it's international law, whether it's the sort of rules of engagement or rules limiting self-defense imposed by the military regime that's governing, or the regime of military law that still governs Yehuda and Shomron. It may be that part of the process of winning the land from our enemies sometimes looks unappealing to those with the inclination towards solving things in court. But it's more complicated than simply saying there are no values in Torah that cohere with this, as we heard in the beginning from this article about recent statements by Rav Lichtenstein. It's a more complex discussion that anyone who comes to these sources with seriousness has to acknowledge. And ultimately, I think what we can hope, B'ezrat Hashem, for Am Yisrael, is that if we have enough fierceness, then we can merit the sweetness that comes afterwards. The same way in the riddle of Shimshon, Ma'az yatsa matok umeochel ma'achal, right? That from fierceness came something sweet, when he finds the honey in the carcass of the lion that he destroyed. And so something that we can eat comes from one who would have devoured us. That you have to, at some level, be like Shimshon a bit. And if you want to get the honey, you need to tear the lion apart first. So we start with being fierce, and then we end with the sweetness. But it's a process, and it requires the right resolve and the right priorities.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.